colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we open up the panel devoted to the future of party democracy, and in particularly to the cartel parties and the challenge at the European level for democracy. Now, this panel has been affected by a number of negative developments, one of which is that we have lost one of the speakers, more in a moment. The second being that we have lost a quarter of an hour of our time, so that we have to reorganize our presentation in view of these constraints. The panel is about several things, and you can imagine that so many things compressed in 1 hour might generate some problem. It is first and foremost a panel that is trying to honor the memory of our colleagues, Peter Mair, who was professor at the European University Institute and died suddenly and unexpectedly in 2011. But the honoring of the memory of Peter is done through discussing topics that were very dear to him and very and concerned him. It is therefore a panel, second, about a large project that Peter initiated with Richard Katz about the change in party organization long time ago, and several volumes and several papers have issued from this. And I suppose you are somehow familiar with the idea of the cartel party that emerged out of this project. As there is a new we will know more about that, last volume which has recently been published by Richard, adding the name of Peter, Democracy and the Cartelization of Political Parties, Oxford University Press, we want also to discuss about this most recent development. It is a panel about what are the developments in the cartel party literature. And finally, it is a panel about how this organizational transformation of the parties have affected representation and democracy. Because, of course, the nature of political parties is core to representation and democracy, because the only democracy we know so far is party democracy, waiting for new concept and labeling of. These themes strongly reflect the intellectual trajectory of Peter Mair, that very early on started. I thought to introduce to you to some of the early writing of Peter on party organization, but I will cut all this, try to leave more space for my speakers. But Peter was always concerned about party organization. And if I can put in a short term his attitude, Peter was a sort of disillusioned old social democrat that was already worried about the mass parties disappearing and the coach-old party. You remember Kirchheimer's idea of a different type of party was already a concern for him. And this early concern for party organization, for instance, for the decline of party membership, which he was worried since long time, in his last writing developed into a concern not for the fate of political parties, but what, as I said, is very linked to the political party, the nature of representation and the nature of democracy. And Peter became a bit negative or pessimistic about this development in his last writing. So we have tried to follow in this panel these theoretical threads: party organization, representation, democracy, and also this Peter's kind of development. The idea was very simple. I would have introduced shortly the speakers and this thread, and this I will do. On my left is Professor Richard Katz from the Johns Hopkins University. On my right, Professor Luciano Bardi from the DUI. The idea was that Richard would have said something about this last volume and the development of the party organization project, so far, and the literature, presumably, that has followed from that. Following that, however, we have invited Professor Ingrid van Biesen to get more on the question of the Cartel Party and on the literature about the Cartel Party. Professor van Biesen cannot be with us, which has not only gender unbalanced the panel, but also deprived the panel of one of its key pillars. We will try to make up for this. And finally, Luciano would have concluded this thread with reflection concerning party government and representation. I've been as short as I could be, and I will immediately give the floor to Richard for his first intervention. We'll try hard to leave a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes for questions and a bit of debate. We'll do our best. Thank you. Richard.
You have a problem with the slides here.
What should I do? Because I'm not the right person to solve problems with the slides.
Sarah is coming to the rescue. Yeah, we have to go all the way forward. Yeah, okay, I figured that. More. Okay,
There.
here's Dick.
That you'll be happy to know is my one and only slide. And as Stefano said, we agreed that I would talk about that, which is the book, which is the culmination of the party organization project that Peter and I started in the 1980s. And for quite some time, it really looked like that was a book that was going to join Warren Miller and Donald Stokes' representation and the American Congress as a much anticipated forthcoming book that never actually came forth. But in this case, even though the first outline that I could find of the book dates from 1997, and the contract for the book dates from about 2002, it has actually appeared, including several chapters that Peter had produced early drafts of before he tragically died. And as Stefano said, the book came out the end of last year. The Cartel Party thesis is really the intertwining of two observations. One concerns the evolution of patterns of inter-party competition leading by the late 20th century to the tacit formation of a cartel of mainstream parties, from which the thesis takes its name. And the other concerns the adaptation of the internal organization of those parties, leading to the idea of the cartel party as an organizational type analogous to the mass party or the catch-all party. So to briefly summarize the argument about patterns of competition, we begin with the elite parties of the 19th century. While there was real competition among them, it was competition within a small, albeit growing segment of society, and a segment that, especially following the French Revolution and then the revolutions of 1848, often felt itself to be under threat. But from the perspective of the excluded classes, those ruling parties could well be seen as a cartel. And indeed, exactly that language was used in Germany near the end of the 19th century. In time, of course, the excluded segments organized into what became the mass party. Especially in their early days, those parties represented a potentially revolutionary, in the literal sense, challenge to the established political systems, in part because they overtly claimed to represent only one segment of a divided society instead of claiming to represent some vision of a single national interest. The result was competition based on demonization of the other side, and at least on the left, the mobilization of a classe gardée rather than cross-cleavage appeals. From the right, competition was also frequently about identity. But for them, nationalism or regionalism or religion, rather than class, was the organizing principle. In the post-war period, the breakdown of social segmentation and the rise of the catch-all party brought about a shift in the perceived role of a party from being primarily the representative of a fixed and bounded set of interests to acting as a broker among shifting combinations of cross-cutting interests and between those interests and the state, with competition based less on ideology or identity and more on delivery of services. So by the end of the 20th century, even that pattern of competition had become problematic. With expansion of services without insupportable tax increases, or reduction of taxes without insupportable service cuts, widely accepted to be impossible. Having formed a rough consensus among themselves that Europeanization, fiscal restraint, globalization, humanitarian treatment of migrants, cultural liberalism and secularization were the only responsible policies possible, competition came to be based more on management, with essentially technocratic standards of success. But that policy consensus existed far more at the elite level than it did in the broader society. Each of those policies had losers as well as winners. And from the perspective of those not seeing themselves to benefit from this brave new world, the mainstream parties in effect appear to have formed a cartel, analogous to the cartel of the elite parties with which we started. They appear increasingly self-referential, indifferent to the world outside of the capital, more interested in maintaining their own positions than in representing the needs of citizens, protecting themselves and feeding at the public trough without delivering much of value in return. Although I'm supposed to be talking about the new book, I want to quote something that Peter and I wrote in our 1995 Cartel Party article on the subject of what were then relatively new extreme right populist parties. What we wrote is this: all these parties appear to espouse opposition to the consensus that now prevails in most of the Western democracies, and this obviously provides a major basis for their support. But what is perhaps more striking is that many of these parties also appear to be gaining great mileage from their assumed capacity to break up what they often refer to as the cozy arrangements that exist between the established political alternatives. In effect, therefore, by operating as a cartel, the cartel parties are often unwittingly providing precisely the ammunition with which the new protesters of the right can more effectively wage their wars. I'll come back to those wars in a minute. But first I want to pick up the other thread of the cartel party thesis, that relating to the internal structure of individual parties. And here I simply want to highlight two central points. One is that politics has become increasingly professionalized, both in the sense that politics increasingly is a career in its own right, and in the sense that political success requires access to a range of professional experts, pollsters, media consultants, fundraisers, and that privileges the party leadership, who hire and fire the experts over the activists. The other central point is that successful pursuit of the cartel strategy requires considerable autonomy for the party in public office. To this end, state subventions provide an element of financial independence from members and donors. Nominal empowerment of the party membership can also further the autonomy of the leaders by transferring power from a more policy or ideologically oriented group of activists in the party on the ground to the presumably more passive and deferential body of members, or even expanding members, beyond members, to supporters. In the nearly quarter century since the original Cartel Party article, the potential problem to which Peter and I alluded in the passage I read a moment ago has become considerably more widespread and serious, amounting in some estimations to a crisis of party democracy. Many commentators attribute the current crisis to similarly current events, especially the financial crises beginning in 2008 and to the immigration crisis more recently. To the contrary, our book ends, and I want to more or less conclude, I'm less than halfway through, so using the word conclude is a little bit of false advertising, by suggesting that the real root of the problem lies in the inability of the cartel parties and the cartel party system to meet expectations, in part because those expectations are themselves internally inconsistent on at least 3 dimensions. And this allows, and to some extent even justifies, the new populists in not simply saying that the ruling party has failed and now the opposition should have a turn, but that the entire system is broken. Now, the first of these dimensions reflects the tension between representation of popular preferences and expertise in policy making and management. Cartelization implies giving priority to the managerial role, deferring to experts over popular demands, and as the last step, trying to shift blame to the technocrats. The second results from trying to hold 2 incompatible visions of democracy at the same time. On the one hand, a communitarian, single national interest model, and on the other hand, an individualistic, legitimately conflicting interest model. Parties are expected to represent the personal and sectional interests of their supporters on pain of having those supporters feeling unrepresented, but they're also expected to rise above partisanship to govern in the national interest. In a rather telling use of language, to accuse a politician of acting in a partisan way, or indeed of even acting politically, has become a criticism. And those then feed into the third tension, which follows from incompatible notions of the proper nature of parties in a democracy. On the one hand, principled and internally democratic organizations of citizens, and on the other hand, responsible teams of leaders compromising to form governments. But in compromising, leaders risk appearing to have abandoned their campaign pledges to satisfy their own lust for office, leaving them as apparently unreliable agents of their electors. So over time, a number of developments have made the mainstream parties particularly vulnerable to challenges by rising populists. Detachment from parties and more generally atomization of society have left many people without strong feelings of belonging, available in the terms that Stefano and Peter used in one of their early works. The increasingly tight restrictions on party policy, whether imposed by reality or by choice, whether imposed on the parties or by the parties, have fostered the appearance of parties as agents of an inter-party and indeed international elite combination of governments, bankers, globalized businesses, rather than agents of society working to control those forces in the interests of ordinary citizens. This then resonates with the populist belief that the powers that be are in a conspiracy to protect themselves at the expense of the people, that the mainstream parties have become part of the problem rather than being part of the solution. All of that has the potential to support a challenge to the legitimacy of the current party systems, or even to the legitimacy of party government as a way of institutionalizing democracy. In particular, if the people come to see the alternatives offered by the ostensibly competing parties simply as choices among different members of the same gang, then loss of support for the core of the party system, and not just for the particular parties that happen to be in office, is likely to result. Notwithstanding the results of the Spanish election on Sunday, there's been a lot of talk about the collapse of social democracy in Europe. But what's most noticeable, and in fact is reflected in the Spanish result, is how little of the loss of support by one side of the mainstream goes to the other side of the mainstream. Although democracy may not be in peril, the growth of populism has led some to that conclusion. And the natural question, Pace Lenin, is what is to be done? One common idea is that the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. Increased internal democracy in the form of empowerment of members or voters to choose candidates and to decide which candidates from a party's list actually will be elected, generally has been supported on the assumption that it will force party leaders to be more responsive. But responsive to whom? To activists, to members, to supporters, to the whole electorate? Certainly, the American experience with primary elections suggests potential negative consequences of empowering members and supporters. One is a reduction of party cohesion. Politicians who will have to compete against other members of their own party have far less incentive to act together when in office. But without party unity, meaningful party government is impossible. Second consequence is to reinforce the incentives for extremism, intransigence, and attempts, even by longtime office holders, to assume the mantle of outsider and to run against the establishment, even as they are part of it. And even if that strategy is successful on a personal level, it also reinforces the populist claim that the institutions of government are fundamentally corrupt. Third consequence follows from the fact that once in office, politicians often have to walk back the promises made in the intra-party arena so as to make coalition building possible. But then they appear inconsistent, insincere, or simply opportunistic. Or they can try to avoid clear positions in the first place, for example, appealing to tribal loyalties and antagonisms at the cost of appearing without principles. In either case, the result again effectively is to confirm the anti-party system populist view. Calls for more internal party democracy often reflect nostalgia for an imagined golden age of the mass party. And in this respect, it's worth recalling the adage from the American humorist Will Rogers that things ain't what they used to be, and what's more, they probably never were. And also to recall that one major thrust of research in the decades following World War II was to call into question both the capacity of voters and their commitment to liberal values. It may well be that the problem is not too much internal democracy, or not too little internal democracy, but too much. Stefano tells me I have very little time, so I will skip a little bit and conclude with the conclusion, which is to say that despite the pessimism of everything I have said so far, and the even more pessimistic bit I just cut out, all is not necessarily without hope. Much of what's being said about the cartel parties by their anti-party system challengers reflects complaints that were made by 19th century socialists against the bourgeois cartel of elite parties. While the bourgeois fear of the collapse of liberalism before the socialist onslaught reflects much of the anguish of the current mainstream when confronted by the current rise of populism. If history repeats itself, however, one might look for a split in the populist movements, akin to that which occurred within the socialist ranks, with Social Democrats moderating both their demands and their rhetoric and ultimately becoming part of the responsible mainstream. And there already is some evidence of splits in the anti-party system parties on both the left and the right. In that scenario, with populists playing the role of the early mass parties and the current mainstream or cartel parties cast in the role of the old elite parties, we might look for a new synthesis. While that would be entirely consistent with the model of evolutionary party development that's central to the cartel party thesis, it is still far too early to say what that new synthesis is likely to be. So with that, I will.
Thank you very much, Richard, for both your substantive comments and timely. Now, Richard already opened up venue for the next consideration. One thing is very clear. The literature on cartel party of the 90s, it's an essential starting point for understanding party politics of today. I mean, it is the starting point where we can understand what's happening or what has been happening. Without the cartelization, we would probably not have seen many other things. So, if I can use a boutade, if the cartel party thesis argued that parties are probably governing and these come to the detriment of their capacity to represent, we now face development in which we could say very shortly that parties are representing and this come to the detriment of their capacity to govern. Now, with this boutade, I pass the floor to Luciano, who will probably reflect on some of this issue in terms of the model of party democracy and the representation implied in it.
Okay, thank you, Stefano. Well, you basically have said it already, so, but anyway, I'll try to add some details to what you just anticipated. I have a slide about the structure of the presentation. I will not go through it line by line because I know I would start anticipating bits of the presentation and I will get lost. So, you know, if you want to read it while I say something more general about how all of this fits with Peter Mair's legacy. Peter has, as you know, given an enormous contribution to political science, and he has introduced many, well, maybe not introduced, but certainly added new depth to many concepts that we have used in political science. And as such, I think he has given a great contribution to the theory of democracy. We were saying before, talking amongst ourselves, that Peter Mair was not a theorist, but he has showed many ways in which we can improve our theoretical reflection and certainly conceptualization of democracy and related topics. So I've kept that long enough for you to read if you wanted to. So that's what this paper, well, there's really no paper. This presentation is all about. So let's move on to the next slide if this works. Well, one of the things on which Peter Mair has given a great contribution is the responsiveness-responsibility tension. As Stefano has said and Dick has argued, Western democracy is based on party government. And so according to the classic view of democratic party government, parties should be sympathetically responsive to their supporters and to public opinion moods. You know, Dick was saying there are various ways in which they can be responsive. In different historical phases, the focus of party responsiveness has changed, but I would say, you know, we can go from hardcore membership to public opinion in general. But at the same time, they have to be responsible. Stefano was saying before, you can represent and not govern, or govern and not represent. Well, it's part of this tension again. If you are responsible towards constraints that force decisions that are not exactly responsive, usually you are governing. Sometimes you're not. Okay, so ideally, responsiveness implies the existence of dedicated and effective input mechanisms and an ability by parties to respond accordingly. Well, this process is rather short-term because you must capture what the prevailing mood is at any given time, and you have to give responses to it. Responsibility, on the other hand, requires a long-term vision, judgment, and ability to respond to needs that are not necessarily articulated as specific demands by those who are to be represented. What are we doing now about the environment, for instance? Now it's a hot topic. 15 or 20 years ago it wasn't, but maybe we should have done something about it then. That would have been responsible. Okay? Still on this tension, responsiveness and responsibility can be seen as being respectively connected to A, representation, and B, government. Again, I'm going back to Stefano, he's already said it all in one boutade. I have a...
The moderator has to make one boutade.
Yes, okay. Anyway, indeed, parties still have at least these two residual functions. They've given up most of their functions. These two are still with the parties. And of course, these two functions give them two roles in party government models. The problem is that these two roles have become more and more difficult to reconcile. And in some cases, it looks like they may be almost incompatible because of changing internal conditions of party government, and also, of course, increasing salience of other external level of governance and external constraints. These two elements are components of what Peter Mair called the hollowing of democracy. In particular, I think actually I should have progressed. Sorry, I usually don't work with this thing. I had slides for everything I said. Now I think I'm caught up with myself. Okay, I hope you still managed to follow. Anyway, in particular, the increase of the responsibility tension may be due to a declining capacity of parties to read, control, and shape public opinion, moods, and demands. You gonna do it for me? No, I'm okay now.
Oh, it does, okay. Sorry.
I'm caught up.
Okay, sorry.
All right. No, I usually do it here, see? All right. The growing weight of external constraints and party action changes in the relationship between elites and citizens, which have become more direct and short-term. So all of these elements change the nature of the tension between responsiveness and responsibilities, because there is a difference between ordinary conditions in which this tension develops and emergency conditions. Well, the idea is that for the last 15 years, at least, some people would even say since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the bipolar system, the bipolar international system, we are in an emergency situation. Not only have we had globalization as a general macro phenomenon, but other elements of international relations, especially economic ones, migration, but I will also say power shifts and realignments in the international system, the ascent of new powers economically and potentially militarily. All of these things have created situations that, compared to what we had in the first 50 years, the post-war periods, called for a permanent emergency. Moreover, ordinarily, the time frame for responsive politics is shaped by electoral cycles. Politicians worry about being reelected. And the time frame for responsible politics is characterized by more extended and time-consuming procedures. Now, considering all of this, and because of this, Peter Mair said that the hollowing of Western democracy had been unfolding for several decades when he wrote, the book was published in 2013, 2 years after his death, but obviously he was elaborating on this at least 4 or 5 years before. And to a large extent, he characterized this emptying out of democracy as a decline of responsiveness. He went as far as saying that we're witnessing an easing away of the demos. And this, of course, he attributed to the failure of political parties in many policy areas. I think Dick has mentioned that already. I won't elaborate. On the fact that because of this momentous transformation of the systems, economic, financial, political, non-political policy making has taken over. Technicians make decisions, not only political technicians. There are independent agencies. In Italy, everybody was waiting for what the Standard & Poor had to say last week. And so, we are now in a condition not to really be able to make political decisions based only on the evaluation of what the electorate expects. And I could go on. So now, instead of parties, very often we find ourselves in a situation where we have leaders and their advisors. The Trump administration seems to be the quintessential example of this. I think let me, no, I've gone too far. Sorry. Okay, I know why I lost one of the paper slides. Okay. Something doesn't work here. I'm sorry. Okay.
Never use lines.
I don't know what happened here. Okay, well, anyway, now I'm here now. I know what happened. That's what happened. This happened to me before. They must, in the presentation, skipped two of the, see, I always like to have my own flash memory, and whenever there is a centralized system of slide projections, there's always one or two slides that miss. Okay, then I'll continue. I'm sorry. I will simply continue then with my written and printed ones. Okay. Now, so at EU level, permissive consensus made all of this acceptable. More in general, we could say that we have a situation in which citizens' indifference, the early years of the European Union consensus was based on the expectation that the people did not care because they didn't have to incur any costs. So the citizens' indifference could occur when conditions exist that permit the system to survive on the basis of diffuse support. This is when there are long periods of sustained growth. Failure can be due to party inability to engage citizens in conventional politics. A cleavage shift has occurred, and a more ethical dimension is emerging. It's always existed, of course, but for a long time it was superimposed totally to the left-right economic dimension. As the economic conditions have deteriorated, if not in general for the overall economy, but within given societies, these two dimensions have started to separate and to become increasingly divergent. Since I don't have much time, and I have to jump to what is, I will leave. Okay. As a result of all of this, then, and the emergence of this more ethical dimension, the EU, in the European Union, democratic accountability is ineffective in both existing channels of representation. In the European Union, we have two channels of representation, the supranational one, which is the one that has suggested the existence of the democratic deficit at European level because mostly of the inadequacy of the EP's, the European Parliament's powers, and then the intergovernmental, which is formally the one where democracy works, because it's based on the legitimacy that the individual governments have, and it comes from their national elections. What we witness now are let me see if I can get at least to this slide. This is crazy. Yeah. We have an increasing relevance of various forms of skepticism. I take this again from Peter Mair, and then I elaborate a bit on that. Traditional Euroscepticism against European institutions, what Peter Mair called polity skepticism, that is, against how national polities are governed ineffectively by the cartel parties, and then what I call selective or horizontal Euroscepticism, which is expressed selectively against other member states. And I believe that these last two elements, two forms of skepticism, are the most dangerous because, and I will finish hopefully quickly, what horizontal Euroscepticism does is to limit the confederate views, to show the limits of the confederate views of Europe in that opposition to European issues and to European progress is not expressed directly by anti-European parties and actors, but it is expressed indirectly in a horizontal fashion by attacking other member states, even by parties that are pro-European. I have a slide here that more or less indicates what the characteristics are. I'm showing this thing. People can see it, they can read it for themselves. The difference is here then that it is a very subtle and dangerous manifestation of anti-Europeanism because it does not affect the European institutions directly, but it undermines the principles on which the European Union effectively works. Member states that are officially committed collectively for the progress of the European Union are undermined in this effort by the development of these anti-European feelings that are, as I would say, deviously not expressed against the European Union, but against individual member states. Let me show you one example of this. This was a poster in the 2014 European elections. This poster was by a pro-European party, Italia dei Valori. What does it say? Europeans, not Germans. This was the time at which there was a huge protest in Southern Europe against the mighty German government that was imposing unfair measures on the Greeks, and here in Italy we were told the same thing would happen to us. I'm sorry for this mix-up. This panel was not really very, thank you very much for your attention and for your patience. It was not very lucky, I guess. I had to figure out what happened to those 3 slides that disappeared and threw me off course. Sorry. But anyway, we still have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Luciano. I mean, despite the fact that our panel time was cut to a quarter of an hour. We managed to finish at some stage, leaving about 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour for question. I hope that the speakers and my boutade have offered some opportunity to raise question and to ask to the speaker whether they can develop further any of their rather coincides and condensed thoughts. We have 10 minutes, roughly, perhaps even 15. Any question from the floor? Oh, sorry. Please.
Comments on the Italian and Finnish politics. Maybe you could see how you see the politics of this playing out.
That's not a question from our floor.
Okay. Ooh. I hope somebody in the other room is now not sort of blasted, you know. My name is Marietje Schaak. I'm a member of the European Parliament from the Netherlands, where in our Dutch Parliament last week there was a vote against the words "an ever closer union," supported by the Prime Minister's parliamentarians, just to give you an impression of how anti-European tones are becoming very much mainstream. I wanted to ask a question because, as you're probably aware, Professor Katz, the term cartel parties has been embraced wholeheartedly by our new populist party, so-called Forum for Democracy, led by Thierry Baudet, who is attacking the mainstream parties as a cartel, alleging sort of collusion against the people on a daily basis. Are you aware of this? Okay, that's a piece of information. No, but a few questions, because I think this, the question of promises of politicians in campaigns is a very important one. And I wanted to ask a reflection on promising a process. So, for example, promising to participate in a government or promising to want to bridge the gap between left and right, aside from promising to deliver, you know, utopian kind of aspirations, like retiring at the age of 50 or something like that. So what I see as a trend is to also take a position in the campaign as to the process after the elections. In other words, to be willing to be part of a coalition, or rather to have strong red lines which indicate that cooperation may not be as possible. And then I wanted to ask also about how you read the behavior of newcomers on the political scene, populist parties, that to some extent place themselves perpetually outside of the mainstream by, for example, having anti-constitutional propositions in their party programs. So, you know, on the one hand, they say we want to do everything differently. On the other hand, they may not be willing to take that responsibility and instead are persuading so-called established parties to move their way and upsetting the political landscape in many ways. So can you reflect on the impact of populist parties on established parties, and also on the question, when do populist parties become the establishment themselves?
Do we want to collect all the questions and give, perhaps it's better, because otherwise we won't go beyond one question. I see a second and third and fourth. Okay, let's see whether we can collect these four.
It works. I'm a bit scared now, but yeah. Leo Soltenartels, I am Dutch like Mrs. Schaake, but I'm just an official and I work for the Council of the European Union. I had a question about, to Professor Katz and to all of you actually, on whether there has been some scientific reflection on the impact of including or excluding populist parties within government coalitions. In the last 25 years, in 4 countries in northern member states of the European Union, and including that the Netherlands, so that's the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden and Finland, there have been fierce discussions on this for many years, and 2 of them have chosen to systematically or almost systematically exclude populist parties from participating, Sweden completely and the Netherlands for most of those years. while others, such as Denmark and Finland, on the contrary, have chosen to include them, or at least as external support to minority governments. In the end, it seems to me that the results in terms of impact of their ideas, which is, I guess, the main meter by which to measure what the influence is more or less the same in those four. So a bit catch-22. Which has there been any research on how this works, if impact is positive or negative? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then is your turn, lady. Can I ask you to be... Unfortunately, we are under a very tough schedule. We have to free the room by 12, so that's the reality.
Right, Corinna Stratulat. I work for the European Policy Center in Brussels. I wanted to ask whether you think that we are we're going through a phase which is compelling political parties to change and adapt again, like they've done it so many times in the past. And at the end of which there will emerge at least a new type of party, or they will emerge as new political animals, but they will remain central to our understanding of democracy, or whether we are passing through a phase which is compelling us to, as Peter Mair used to say, redefine democracy, but this time without political parties being at the center of it. So a redefinition of democracy in which political parties may no longer be relevant, and therefore challenging a very long-held belief that we've had, that we cannot comprehend democracy without political parties. So which one do you think it is?
Thank you. It is your turn, sir. Sorry, I don't know your name. Introduce yourself.
Thank you. I will be very brief. I'm Jeroen Hooyer. I'm the third Dutch here in the room. Since Ajax won, we dare now to speak up. Two very brief questions. First of all, is this not of all times? 20 years ago, we also had very nationalistic parties. Think about Le Pen in France. So don't you invent something now this morning? Second question is, the number of the participation in political parties goes down, at least in my country. Where do these people go? People are still engaged in maybe sectorial things for environment or for, I don't know, international politics. So people are still engaged, but not in political parties. Have you done research about that and the influence on the political landscape?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll give now the floor to the speaker, but I cannot resist to make a point. First of all, the fact that in the Netherlands, a political party used the Cartel party literature to attack the elites, it's flattering for us. But it also shows that the Dutch are the only one who reads. who reads, because I don't know of any other country in which a specialized subsector of the party literature has been used as a campaign weapon. Sorry, we are all on the time. I think you go first, and you have 2 minutes each, 2 minutes and a half each, if we want to stop at 12. Richard.
Okay, I'm not so much going to answer questions as just respond to the subjects. Peter and I met in the context of Rudolf Wildermann's Future of Party Government project, in which I wrote an essay that started, roughly speaking, that anybody who read the literature from the 1970s would be relieved that democracy had survived into the 1980s. So this is a crisis which has been going on for 50 years, and one could ask whether anything which has been going on for 50 years qualifies as a crisis. But the question of where do the people go? Party membership is declining. Parties are trying to redefine membership in ways which will arrest the decline. That's the best they have done, even in Canada, where the Liberal Party has redefined membership as simply signing up on a website in the same way that the Five-Star Movement in Italy has defined membership, hasn't arrested it. But people are going into interest groups, civil society organizations, the Facebook blogosphere, disorganized, And that actually then feeds into the question of non-party democracy. There is a panel this afternoon as part of this conference on the question of, do we need politicians? Which I take it is also a non-party democracy sort of thing. And while I think that is imaginable, see, for example, Louis Napoleon, all one needs to do is turn on the television, don't watch the programs, watch the advertisements, and you can see how easily we think ordinary people are manipulable. And I think we are going to find that political parties are an essential, not just to represent, but also to fail to represent some of these unrealistic, irresponsible, illiberal demands which are endemic in a population which is always asked, what do you want, not what can you do or what's realistic. In the perfect world, if you were king, what would you do? We are in an era in which we have increasingly empowered citizens. We have told citizens, and citizens have told us we love democracy, but citizens continue to hate politics. And in that respect, the claim that we will bridge the left-right divide appeals to the idea that there is a national interest and all of this disagreement is just intellectual squabbles by self-interested elites. Until the politicians move to the center and somebody out at the extremes feels unrepresented. And in this case, the extreme may simply be the fisherman or the union leader who is losing what he thinks is in the national interest because it's in his group's interest in the name of European solidarity, the necessities of globalization, you name it, whatever reason for bridging the left-right gap leaves everybody else unrepresented. That must have taken my 2 minutes.
I wonder what
Two of mine as well.
comment. The last minute is yours.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't need more than that because the questions were mostly about parties, and my presentation was only marginally about parties. It was more about how whoever is in government is faced with the difficulties of reconciling the need to respond to the electorate and the need to govern. And I think that being the case, I don't see how this can change simply because parties are becoming different animals. Someone will have to make decisions that are targeting the important problems in the short or in the long term, and in the long term. And so I think what kind of parties will do that, or what kind of political organizations will do that, is not the essential focus. I think the problem is how can we sell this need to the people, to the electorate, and the reason why I'm very pessimistic is that this kind of approach to democracy saw its heyday in the 40, 50 years in which the world experienced fairly homogeneous and sustained economic growth. Now, I'm not saying that we do not have economic growth. The economies are bigger now than they were 15 and 20 years ago, for sure. But what is happening is that the ups and downs are so pronounced and so strong as to make it extremely difficult to secure, for whoever is in government, the sustained support of the people. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I much regret that we have been so constrained. It seems that there was interesting stuff to go on in the discussion. that was our time. Thank you very much for having participated. These are tour de force. These are not debates. These are tour de force.
Power of the powerless, democratic politics from below in an age of distrust is going to start.
Sarah, thank you all for coming to join this parallel session. It's really a great honor to be moderating the panel on the power of the powerless. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, Austria, and I run a project called Europe's Futures, and we have a fellowship that looks at the issues of democracy, or rather the problems and challenges to democracy, asylum, and also the questions of enlargement. And we're particularly happy at the Institute to be partnering with EUI and the State of the Union and with the Erste Foundation, which is funding our project. And needless to say, it's after having an all-male panel, it's wonderful to have an all-woman panel, except for the moderator. So we're trying to keep the gender balance, at least this morning, in the Sala that we're in. I will briefly introduce all the speakers who, as the cliche goes, no need for introduction. To my left is Professor Mary Kaldor from the London School of Economics, and who, apart from being an academic, has also been a civic activist for most of her life, so particularly qualified to address the issues that we're addressing here. To my right, Heather Graby, who is the director, among all other things, of the Open Society European Policy Institute, sorry. OSEPI is the one that I call you by. And last but not least, Rosa Balfour, who this year is a Europe's Futures Fellows at the IWM, but in her full daytime job is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where I used to work for many years, and we were colleagues then. I think this panel follows particularly well the one where we had just now about party politics and about the hollowing out of politics and party life. And the way that we conceived this panel with our co-organizers here at the Institute was really to look at what is the movement of democracy that is beyond party politics and that we have seen all around basically the Western world, whether it's Occupy Wall Street, whether it's the Indignados, and all the similar protests that are following in my country, which is Serbia. As some of you know, there have been protests for 5 months now, every Saturday in the streets, similar things in Albania. And just as a footnote, one of our colleagues criticized the fact that we don't have an East European on the panel, so I am the East European as the moderator, or the Southeast European, and represent one of these people who come from the depth of the post-communist world. The fact that politics has had this expression because of the anger of the people, the disappointment with politics, the sense of disaffection and disempowerment that people have felt, that the usual cliche of criticism that all the decisions are made in Brussels and everything that follows from that, I think is the sort of food for what has been leading people to try and, quote unquote, take back control in all its mitigated and various forms that we have had around Europe. As someone whose profession was academic and political philosophy before the world turned upside down with the disappearance of my country called Yugoslavia, which is now 7 countries, and engaging against an authoritarian leader called Milosevic, I used to study Machiavelli. The fact that Machiavelli, and I guess this is an appropriate place to talk about it, Florence, his insistence on the vivere civile, on the civic living, on the vivere libero, I think is something of a constant in the desire of citizens to be free, to be able to freely express themselves and to have, obviously, a form of representation where their voices, if not directly heard, can be heard through a mediated form, and that is why, among other things, we have a political party. So that's kind of the framing of this panel. And what I've suggested to my colleagues and friends is that they each speak for about 10 minutes and that we leave as much time as possible for questions and answers. And so without further ado, I'll ask Rosa to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Ivan. I will try to go through my arguments in terms of bullet points. I won't take you through the thinking that led me to these conclusions. And what I'd like to say, 3 points. The first is that if Europe is stuck, it is because of a democratic recession in Europe, more so than the economic crisis or refugee influx and political crisis that followed. It follows, therefore, that addressing the quality of democratic life needs to be behind any attempt at political and policy reform. And I think we need to focus on processes and on identifying who the game changers might be, and I'll try to do that. I will also argue that through rethinking democratic processes, the EU actually has a unique opportunity to change the way it carries out policy, to make it more participatory and more inclusive. So these are my 3 main points. I'll start with the democratic recession. This is partly by design. The ideology of neoliberalism has disenfranchised state institutions in making decisions about how to regulate globalization. We've been witnessing the rise of authoritarianism around the world and in Europe as well, and the closing space for civil society is a phenomenon that is happening across many European countries, not just those governed by semi-authoritarian leaders. But it's partly also due to perhaps unforeseen consequences of Europeanization, of globalization, the impact of the technological revolution. What I'd like to say is that we are witnessing, we can imagine or understand the democratic recession along 2 lines. One is a vertical line. It's about the relationship between the European Union, between national democracies, and between democracy at the local level. And it is at the level of the relationship that we need to look at in order to find solutions. And the second area in which the recession is visible is at the horizontal level, at the transnational level. So what we're seeing at the vertical level is that the relationship between these levels in terms of democratic legitimacy, in terms of decision-making processes, in terms of accountability are no longer straightforward. They're not linear. The panel we came out of in this room really focused at the democratic backsliding at the national level through political parties that are no longer performing their role as linkages between society and state institutions, between society and power, what Peter Mair called the void. And I think this is probably the area where the greatest deficiencies and where the democratic recession is taking place most importantly. But it's also happening in the way in which member states relate to the EU and to EU decision-making processes, where a lot of power has been concentrated at the level of the heads of state and government. And it hasn't been matched by equally pertinent and relevant processes of subsidiarity, what is called in the EU subsidiarity, and that is bringing policies closer to the local level. Subsidiarity through federalism, through decentralization, has also, it's very uneven, of course, across Europe. We have very different examples depending on which country we look at, but austerity has emptied the perhaps good intentions of subsidiarity, leaving local authorities without the powers or the resources to deliver services close to the citizens. So we have at this 3 level this dysfunction. The other level is the horizontal level, and here it's very much a consequence of globalization, that policy areas have become far more diffuse and cut across boundaries, national boundaries. Obvious examples are climate change, migration, and we can see that on very concrete examples. For instance, housing policy, which is very much a local issue, is being affected by immigration, which is increasingly assigned to the foreign ministers to deal with at the EU level. So we see that a very local problem requires solutions that are taken at an EU level in cooperation in cooperation amongst states, and that relationship between the local policy and the actual decision making is not the line is not strong enough democratically. So I think the key question really is about who decides, on what grounds these decisions are made, what is the legitimacy of these decisions, and this is all the more important and pertinent when it comes to transnational policies that take place on a space which transcends the national unit. So this, in my view, is the way in which the democratic recession is taking place in Europe. It's also taking place elsewhere. It is a global phenomenon. We know this. So we have decisions on issues that have become more complex, but the decision-making processes have stayed behind. They're stuck in the 20th century. This democratic recession and the void have created space for newcomers. We know that that space has been exploited very successfully by populist parties. But there are also other movements that need to be looked at. There have been instances in which these spaces have been influenced by other actors. I'm thinking of protest movements, I'm thinking of civil society organizations, civic activism, community-based initiatives, private actors. I think Mary will talk a bit about this, so I don't want to say too much. What I'd like to ask is, when is it that these experiences are influential? What kind of power can they leverage, and what kind of change can they bring about? From experience, I've been looking at three areas. One is climate change and the Paris Agreement. Another is migration policy. And another is civil society, and I've focused a bit on Eastern Europe. I will say very little because in the interest of time, but I think with respect to climate change and the Paris Agreement, we saw quite an unprecedented global alliance between NGOs, civic actors, local governments, regional governments, national governments, international organizations, all moving towards reaching that agreement in Paris after the failure of the Copenhagen conference, which was EU-led. And that was a completely different experience. On migration policy, which in many respects is not a very positive example, but we did see NGO mobilization and citizen support who were actually delivering the services to offer decent humanitarian conditions for refugees. And we've also seen a greater involvement of cities and municipalities in seeking solutions. On Eastern Europe, I've recently done some research on Ukraine and Serbia. In Eastern Ukraine, it is quite extraordinary, the resilience that citizens have manifested, and this has been thanks to civil society. And in Serbia as well, again, it's counterintuitive in the sense that it's not a country that is not performing well in terms of classic democratic standards, but we're seeing that through civil society, services are being delivered to citizens, and also the accession process with the EU is actually being monitored and followed through by civil society organizations rather than traditional institutions. So what do these examples tell us? The first is that networks have a huge capacity to bring about change, and they need to be transnational, and they need to be diversified. And I'll quote Václav Havel, The Power of the Powerless. He said that in that essay, he said that Charter 77 would have been unimaginable without the solidarity of widely differing groups. So I think diversity of groups, transnational groups is a key feature of networks that can actually bring about change. They also need to have alliance capacity. This is what we saw with the Paris Agreement, that they were willing to engage also with governments, also with international organizations. So it's not just about protests from below. They're willing to engage with more traditional power. They also need to have ideational capacity, change people's opinions. And they need to have power of attraction, attract greater numbers of members. According to Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's been looking at network theory, new power is based on mass participation and peer coordination. Networks need to be open, participatory, and peer-driven. And leadership is not hierarchical, but it's about building relationships. So I'll move on to my third point, final point, about the opportunity for the EU. I think precisely because the EU is not a nation state, it has the opportunity to engage with these networks in a different way. The EU is by definition multi-level, it's by definition transnational, and networks and alliances can really play a big role here. And I think the way to engage is on policy. We have seen many of these examples are issue-based mobilization. And I think that you can play a role in bringing together these bottom-up instances and think about different ways of doing policy. This is not necessarily a substitute for national politics, but it is a way for making policy at the EU level more open, more participatory, and much closer to what the needs on the ground are. It is messy. This is, even with networks, the democratic accountability is messy, and there are risks involved as well. But I imagine this process as a kind of jam session of bringing in different instances and trying out different possible solutions in order to get Europe and the EU out of the stalemate it finds itself in now. Thank you very much.
Rosa, thanks very much. That's been very helpful, and I think it helps define quite a few of the problems that both citizens are addressing and those of us who are trying to understand and sometimes support some of these initiatives. Mary.
Well, thank you. Ivan asked us all to make 3 points, because academics always think in threes.
I studied at Sciences Po.
Exactly. I'm going to talk partly in a very sort of big picture sense about the current moment and the role of movements in transitions, partly about what movements do and my own experience, and then finally the current situation. So I think my starting point is that we're in one of these big historical moments of transition. It's the end of the American model of development based on mass production, the intensive use of oil, the interventionist state, the Cold War framework, whatever. And we're moving towards something new, which we don't know what it is, but very central to it is the spread of information and communications technologies. And in these kinds of transition periods, you always get a terrible crisis. Gramsci talked about morbid symptoms. The old is dying and the new cannot be born. And I think the way to understand that is that political change and economic and technological change operate at different paces. Economic and technological change is, well, it speeds up and slows down, but it's permanent. It's based largely on the market, but other things are important too. Whereas political change can get really stuck. And that's the problem. Our political institutions are really stuck in the old model of development. They were created for the old model of development, and they are stuck in kind of vested interests of the old model of development, and they can't adapt. And in that situation, you get a pervasive loss of trust in government, in political institutions, in parties, and a huge sense of frustration. And that's when new movements emerge. And actually they emerge at both right and left. And transition can be seen as a period of experimentation in which you experiment with the bad as well as the good. And, you know, Brexit is one example of a bad experiment. But we can think of lots of others bad experiments. And when the good finally works, then we can move into a new stage. And just to give you an illustration from the last century, I mean, I think we can see, by the way, to get things, so this painful moment, the sort of bad experiments can involve war, revolution. And if we think about it going over the last century, I would say 1945 was the moment when the Labour movement, what movements rise and fall, and when they reach the peak, institutions accept their agendas and they institutionalize themselves. They become respectable partners. So 1945, I would say, was the moment the Labour movement became institutionalized. It's the moment the welfare state came onto the agenda. It's the moment that Labour movements turned themselves into parties and trades unions and became respectable partners. And that provided a framework that was very important for the spread of the American model of development. I think 1989 was another moment, and that was the moment, I think, when the post-1968 movements were institutionalized. And by the post-1968, I mean movements like peace movements in Western Europe, human rights movements in Eastern Europe, environmental movements, the women's movement. But interestingly, they became institutionalized not in a national framework. They became institutionalized in a European and an international framework. And actually, while I agree completely with what Rosa was saying, I think already if you look at the European Union, it has a much better relationship with NGOs and civil society than national governments do.
Yes, I agree.
So, you know, each time this happens, you get an expansion of institutions. I mean, civil society theory, Machiavelli's civic living, always assumed you required a state, you required a rule of law, and actually civil society and the rule of law were mutually constitutive. But what's happening now is something different, which is that it's, if you like, NGOs, civil society at a European and international level that are kind of constituting global governance, if you like, or regional governments or European governments. So that's my first big general point. And my second point is about what are social movements. And I think the way to understand social movements is that they involve a social learning process. That's what happens when you have social movements. They involve huge and bitter debates and discussions, and through those debates and discussions, they really challenge dominant discourses. And that's, I think, the way to understand it. And I'm just going to briefly say something about my own experience in the 1980s to illustrate that, because for me, that was my formative intellectual period. So I was a peace activist. I was against nuclear weapons. But I was convinced by others, Edward Thompson and other people, that the only way to get rid of nuclear weapons was to end the Cold War. I may have had a personal interest in it because my father was Hungarian, but anyway, our strategy was, we're going to do this by linking up with human rights groups in the East. That's how we're going to end the Cold War. And this involved, the 1980s was a huge argument. So it was an argument on the one hand with the traditional peace activists and left in Western Europe, who thought the way to end the Cold War was to make friends with the Soviet Union, and that we were being instruments of the Cold War by supporting human rights. So we had to make that argument, and we were trying to say, actually, the West provides an argument for oppression in the East, so therefore, by opposing nuclear weapons, it's a way of opening space up. And then we had to have an argument with our East European friends, who felt, large numbers of them, that the West was on their side and that Western armament, it was good for West to be strong to stop the Soviet Union. So we had to have a big argument with them saying, actually, the best chance of freedom is to end the Cold War. It's not to continue to prosecute it. And by the end of the 80s, there was a general consensus that peace and human rights went together. And I think if you really sort of look at the success of these movements, we could talk about lots more detail. It is that sort of post-89 consensus about humanitarianism, human rights and peace, civil society that came out of that discourse. So this is my way of illustrating what I mean by social learning, because these debates went on everywhere. We didn't have the internet at that time, but they went on in magazines, in meetings, in discussions, and you created a whole new set of ideas that were carried through the 1989 revolutions. So now finally my third point, what about the current moment? Well, I'm of course very involved in anti-Brexit movements, and together with Luke Cooper over there, I'm involved in an organisation in Britain called Another Europe is Possible. And it's committed to remaining in Europe, but to transforming it and opposing its neoliberal aspects and others. And I think exactly the same social learning process is going on. That's what we're engaged in. And in a curious way, it's the same people. On the one hand, we have arguments with the old left, who are the same people. Literally, in one case, Seamus Milne, Jeremy Corbyn's head of communications, was the person defending the Soviet Union against us in the 1980s and is now trying to defend Brexit. So literally the same people. We are arguing against the old left, who believe in a strong state, who believe that socialism in one country is possible. That's one set of arguments. And the other set of arguments is against the centrists, who think that we just want to return to the pre-referendum status quo and everything will be lovely. And the argument is there's got to be change across Europe. And I think, I now must put on my glasses. No, that's fine. So what I think we're seeing at the moment, which is incredibly interesting, is a coming together of two sets of activists. On the one hand, we're having a renewal of the climate change activism, and there is a sort of beginning to be an understanding that it's going to be very difficult to do climate change through national context, that it has to be European and it has to be global. And on the other hand, the anti-austerity movements that were previously very national and local based are beginning to realize that their possibilities are much greater if they are pan-European and they operate on a European basis. So what I think is emerging is kind of a new kind of narrative, perhaps similar to what I was talking about before, whether it's the 45 welfare state or the post-89 peace and human rights, which I would summarize as a European or global Green New Deal. The idea that there's got to be huge investment in climate change action, but that huge investment will be a way of ending austerity as well. Now, just to finish, I sound amazingly optimistic. This is the new vision that's going to emerge, but of course we, just like in past transitions, we have to go through an enormous amount of pain. And there's a terrible fight going on, and one can't, we don't imagine to go through a war, which is what's happened in previous transitions, but something similar to a war is we're already seeing in the Middle East, in Syria, in Libya, and the kinds of dangers that are associated with right-wing populism could make change very, very difficult. So I'm not trying to say this is where we're going. Certainly this is where the learning process is going, but whether the learning process is sufficient to avoid the kind of pain we're also likely to go through, I don't want to sound that too optimistic.
Okay, Mary, thanks very much. Thank you. a whole set of questions, of course, that you've raised, and thank you also for bringing in the personal element, which I think is extremely valuable, because a lot of these things concur, and I can fully subscribe to what you said about these being social learning processes, and that's what we had to do as we were mounting during 10 years the overthrow of Milosevic in Serbia that ended in 2000. But we'll leave all that for the discussion. Heather, last but not least.
Well, thank you very much. It's so tempting to respond and enlarge the points made by Rosa and Mary, but I'm going to resist because we'll come to that in discussion. And instead, I'm going to dive down a bit deeper into how the anti-establishment politics have affected the EU over the years, how the EU has responded to them, and how it might do so in the future. So my 3 points will be, first of all, the importance of looking at the ambitions of anti-establishment movements in order to see their effects on the EU and on democracy. Secondly, how the EU responds to them and how very differently it has responded over the years to different ones. And thirdly, how could it interact with them in the future, particularly the ones on climate and on technology, which are the big challenges but also opportunities. So first of all, how has the EU responded to different kinds of anti-establishment movement? It depends enormously on their ambitions. What do they actually want to achieve? If you compare, for example, the Greens, which came in to European politics in the 1960s and 70s with a strongly anti-establishment agenda, and it took them quite a while to work out their position on the EU. Some were very anti-common market, as it then was. In the 70s, they were very and have remained opposed to the neoliberal agenda, and yet, over time, the Greens have been not only absorbed into the EU political system, but now a very vibrant part of it, and one which, you know, in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to see rising in European politics. So how did that happen? Well, one thing was it happened fairly slowly, and you know, not until 84 that they came into the European Parliament, not until 89 that they had a significant presence. It wasn't until 99 that they had their first commissioner. So it was a few decades, really, of evolution. But I'd say that the key difference between what's happened with the Greens and with the radical right populists now is, what are their ambitions? And this is where, although both are now active in the European Parliament, both are providing alternatives to what do they call them, the cartel parties that the previous session discussed. And yet the enormous difference is in their ambitions. The Greens ultimately are making the case for changes, often very radical, but they're changes that can be made through the current democratic institutions and through the means of policies and spending at EU level. Therefore, they became pro-European action because they could achieve things through the current system. And ultimately, what they wanted was a change to the economic system, but they wanted to do it through, in the end, the European institutions. And they've been very successful in greening many EU policies, everything from agriculture through to now some new ideas about climate. So where an anti-establishment movement has policy objectives, because its ultimate aims can actually be achieved through policy, in the end they're going to become pro-EU, I would argue to you, because the EU has these powers. But there are many radical right populist movements which don't have those ambitions. They want to do one of two things. Either they want to stay on the margins of politics and essentially occupy the position that typically populists, as defined by Margaret Canavan and Cass Mudder, want, which is essentially to criticize and sow mistrust about the current establishment, essentially in order to gain attention to themselves, but not really wanting to take power. Think about Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, for example, classic example of a politician who avoids going into government, who deliberately stays in the parliament because that's his natural home. That suits his ambitions well. Whereas if you think about the populist radical right that want to get into power and to hold power, and here I would think about Fidesz in Hungary, for example, that's a different set of ambitions. And there the policy implications can be very complex, because if it's about holding on to power and keeping one party in power for the long term, overriding domestic checks and balances, often the constitutional order, the EU only becomes relevant where it provides obstacles to that ambition. And here again, policies are not necessarily the point. It's about what kinds of legal powers it has that would prevent one party takeover of state institutions. So these are very different kinds of ambitions, and you need to look at what are the ultimate ambitions of a movement in order to see how the EU political system will react to it and what effect it will have on it. And that also, that really leads me to the second point about how the EU responds. Now, the classic way that the EU responds is, first of all, to try to ignore the problem. Stefan Lehner and I wrote an article a few years ago about how the EU responds to populism and to illiberalism, in which we set out the different ways, the kind of classic ways that the EU tries to respond to challenges to its authority from national governments. And of course, here I'm talking about the populists who are in government, not the ones taking potshots from the sidelines. And typically it tends to respond by trying to ignore the challenge and hope that domestic politics will take care of it through a change of government. That's clearly not going to happen when the ambitions of a party are actually to remain in power for the long term by dismantling the possibility of other parties to have a democratically pluralistic contest. And it also tends to try to negotiate with that government in one way or another in order to kind of keep things quiet and maintain the status quo. Clearly that has not worked on the rule of law challenges that have come up because the externalities, the spillover effects on other countries are becoming more and more evident, particularly the spillover effects for the EU's community of law discussed in the rule of law session just now. And also because once governments start very openly giving the EU the finger, that really affects the whole system. So defying EU law, that's a new tactic that's never really been used before. And it means that although the EU was much slower to react to forms of authoritarian leadership, soft despotism, democratic regression in member states, think about Berlusconi, for example, the EU was very reluctant to take any kind of action despite really quite large bottom-up movements resisting his government in Italy. We've seen resistance also in other countries, but the EU won't necessarily challenge a national government because of the kind of polity it is, until the externalities become really large. So what's happening now on rule of law and discussion about Article 7 and so on has many more implications beyond the countries which are involved. It's tended to be Central and East Europeanists who've been following the story most closely, and sometimes rule of law nerds like me. But now this is a much bigger political crisis. This is about the authority of EU law, and it's a political crisis that will go on for much longer, and I would argue could be much bigger than either of the economic or the migration crises over time. So finally, how could the EU interact with civic political movements in the future and think about, what I've just explained to you is a different kind of trajectory from what there's been of either, as in the case of the Greens, absorb and integrate the new movement and in the end make it part of the policies. And I think that will continue with the Greens, as Mary was saying. Green New Deal is the new left. That's the new alternative to neoliberalism, very different from millennial socialism. But I think that's likely to go there. But then with the radical right populists, it's leading towards confrontation, ongoing confrontation, and in the end, potentially a huge constitutional challenge to the European Union. It's not at all evident how that will come out. But there are plenty of civic political movements growing in Europe that the EU can engage with very successfully, precisely because their demands are inherently transnational and require transnational policies over the long term. They require policies over several changes of government, and therefore they need to be coordinated at EU level. There needs to be EU policy frameworks, there need to be EU resources behind them, and essentially the creation of a consensus at EU level, which is something that only really the EU can do. Now, we've seen baby steps to engaging in movements of all kinds through the European Citizens Initiative and also the citizens consultation that took place, otherwise known as the Macron consultation, that took place last year. These are worthy, but they're pretty small scale, and the number of citizens that they've engaged is not a large percentage of the population. But there's a huge opportunity not just to encourage these things from EU level, but really to engage with the new movements that really have a lot of political energy behind them. So I think Mary's point about the new movement on climate is absolutely vital, because the reframing of the issue achieved by Greta Thunberg, Anuna de Wever, and the other teenage climate activists is quite extraordinary. You have all these experts of our generations who talk about narrative change and reframing and so on. And these teenagers have, within a couple of months, completely reframed the issue. They've turned it from being technocratic arguments about how how exactly you organise emissions targets and can you do cap and trade and all the stuff that makes most citizens' eyes glaze over. And they've turned it into an issue of justice, of intergenerational justice. That's a completely different kind of issue that really engages the imagination of citizens. They have a very simple message that is incredibly powerful, which is, okay, you just need to take action and listen to the experts, right? So that's very powerful in itself. And then they've said, this is about your generation taking away our futures. So it's the perfect thing for teenagers, absolutely ideal. But it's also a very fundamental political point that in the party contest of the current EU political system, we essentially look at competing interests between current Europeans. We think about it may be on the basis of class or income or various other means, but it's basically all of just right now. We don't think about the trade-offs between current humans and future humans. And that's really different. And that's where the EU becomes really important, because the EU is good at long-term planning and policy frameworks that survive over decades, we hope, and committing resources over at least 7-year frameworks, which is much longer than most national budgets, and also across not only countries, but also across interest groups. So that's the kind of thing the EU could really engage with, that framing of climate, which makes the EU extremely relevant. So just to give you a short advertisement, we've made this argument in more detail in this paper that will be launched on Monday. But I think the other thing to think about in terms of engaging with civic political movements is that where national parties are largely avoiding setting out big ambitions for the transitions that are facing us on climate, on technology, also on demographic change, civic political movements provide the sense of urgency which is vital to take action. So national parties are super nervous about this. They're still, most of the mainstream parties are still essentially trying to respond to the agenda set by radical right populists, for example, on migration. There is a huge opportunity to take the sense of urgency from the civic political movements, the grassroots, and then translate that into action at EU level. So this, where I think Rosa talked about it as the vertical axis of the democratic recession and filling the void, there's a huge opportunity to fill that void. But the question is, ultimately, that's going to be about the power of the EU to set an agenda through an agreement, through building consensus. And this is very tricky to do when populism is on the rise, and populism is fundamentally opposed to building consensus, to everything that's required to do that through negotiations and through compromise, essentially. They see compromise as betrayal. So I would argue that we've got to the point now in the EU where civic political movements are not a kind of noise, a big noise here on the sidelines, which maybe the EU level might think about engaging with, but it's an absolutely vital resource to keep the EU relevant and to keep populism on the sidelines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. I think that in all three presentations, and thank you for keeping time, that was absolutely superb, made my job and life easier, that we've covered a lot of issues, and I will restrain myself from using the privilege that I have, and I will open the floor immediately because I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and it's wonderful to see a full house on this panel. And I see Luke's hand up first. Just wait for the mic, please.
So my question was to Heather, actually, and thanks to everyone for the presentations. It was fantastic. But I thought your case study of the Greens' turn from anti-establishment to a radical form of the establishment was really interesting. The thing that jumped out of me in terms of the recent experience is that one of the biggest concrete effects of Brexit on the European far right has been putting parties off the idea of leaving the European Union. And you see that really clearly in these European elections. In France, the National Rally, Marine Le Pen's party renamed, has now been very clear they're interested in takeover. They're not interested in exit. The same thing in Austria. And then, of course, there's a different part of the far right present in the EPP in Hungary that you mentioned. So I think, isn't there a danger that the far right are learning the lessons that you described and will increasingly articulate a program for European institutions, which is about a Europe of nation states, which is about border security, deportations, and the whole range of things that European institutions could do if the political makeup of those institutions changed.
Okay, let's take 3-4 questions here, Ambassador. And do introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Johan Verbeek, I'm the Director General of the think tank, Brussels-based think tank, Egmont Institute. Thank you very much to the speakers. Quite an interesting topic, quite a good introduction. The problem, the issue that I have with this question is the following. As the Belgian political philosopher Mouffe quite clearly says, politics thrives on contestation, controversy, discussion, debate. So far, so good. And in that sense, those movements are a healthy, wake-up call for the political class to indeed assume its responsibilities. Where I see a problem, however, and Heather has already responded to some extent to that concern, that is that those movements are not just ventilating their frustration, their feeling left out, but they are also kind of doing it not just outside, but perhaps against the democratic institutional framework that we know. And this seems to me to be potentially a danger in terms of upsetting the democratic legitimacy of the institutions, which we have, a constitutional base and so on, leaving us with an open space in which indeed those who have less good intentions can just step in and walk away with whatever they wish, as we see with some right-wing populist movements. So it seems to me that the answer would be yes, cry, claim, make a lot of noise, but at least do it within an institutional framework, because that was the question that Macron was asking when the Gilets Jaunes started up. Who is your spokesperson? No spokesperson. What is your program? No program. It's full of inconsistent demands. So it was very difficult, to take the French example, even to give the very beginning of a response to whatever they claimed, to the extent that there was something consistent in their claims. So that's my issue and my question.
Okay. And there was a question behind over there. The lady. Yep.
Thank you very much. My name is Giulia Bertezzola. I work for the European Commission. My question is the following. You mentioned two aspects. One is the civic society, the movement, the pressure they can put, and the other is the basically not moving of politics. We know that actually civic society can go to a certain extent, but to make a big change, you need also politics. So I was wondering, how do you reconcile the two aspects? Because even the European Union, I mean, although the European Commission, for example, has put forward a lot of proposals on many different fields, you always encounter the politics. I mean, some of the proposals don't go through because politicians are not following what the civil society asked for. So how do you reconcile, or if you have any example on how it has been reconciled in the past?
Okay, and I'll take a final one in this first round. Any hand? Okay, we'll keep it at the 3 here. Mary.
Okay, well, I'll talk about the last two because I think Luke's was really for Heather.
But you can also comment.
Yeah, I could comment, but I sort of agree with Luke, so okay. I'm not sure I have anything additional to add to that point. But I think what is interesting is the extent to which movements can be very anti-political. Anti-politics was the term coined by Václav Havel and George Conrad, and the idea was that you don't have anything to do with the political institutions because they're corrupt, they're problematic, and we create our own parallel polis, which is what Václav Havel was trying to do. And I think what you saw during the early 2000s with the Social Forum, for example, that was a very anti-political period when movements felt they didn't want to engage with formal institutions. I think this anti-political, there is a really profound shift at the moment, and I think I'm hoping that's what we're going to see during the European elections. I think there's much more engagement with politics than there was in the past. Certainly if I look at the movements in Britain, it's all about the movements relating to parties and how parties act. But I do agree with you that you need mechanisms and political institutions through which movements can act. And that means that even though the movements are outside party politics, they have to engage with party politics and not hope they can go directly to the populace, say. So I think I agree with you on that point. But it relates to another point which I've been thinking about a lot over the years, and I'm beginning to change on that actually, which is that, you know, I had the feeling that we live in a world with a profound democratic deficit, namely that many of the challenges we face are transnational, but our politics is at a national level. And that's why we need the European Union. And I sort of felt the problem is that it's extremely difficult to be politically engaged at the European level or the global level. That they're too far away from most people, that most people can be politically engaged at a local level, but they can't. You know, Spinelli said we lack a democratic European political consciousness, and I really think that's true, that it's very hard for people to be engaged at European level. So the question was, would you square the circle? And does civil society represent a kind of not brilliant, but I think one, Rosencrantz, was it? I can't remember who said, you know, it's a proxy democratic mechanism. And that maybe at European level and an international level, that's how you operate. But actually, I think, oddly enough, because of populism, because of Brexit, there's a much greater political engagement in these European elections. Maybe I'm looking at it from a British perspective than I've ever experienced before. And that maybe it is possible to have something similar at European level, which I always thought before, you know, the European level would have to focus on civil society, and we need as much subsidiarity as possible to get direct links to the citizen. But maybe, you know, maybe we are going to see more and more engagement at European level, which I think could be really important.
Sure. So, a couple of points. One is on this whole question of takeover, not exit. Yeah, absolutely. That's very much the game. There is no possibility of Huxit or Polexit becoming the demand of the current governments in Warsaw and Budapest, for example. And even those countries like, for example, the Netherlands or Sweden, where there had been a push, the public opinion poll numbers have changed. Now, it's really very sad that it takes such a monumental disaster as Brexit to show people the relevance of the European Union. That's perhaps Britain's greatest contribution to European integration might in the end be Brexit, because nobody will ever try it again. But yeah, which is, I mean, you know, breaks my heart as a British citizen. But your point about takeover is absolutely vital. And in fact, I did write something about this, about the illiberal Europe, that is the motivation of these countries. The question of certain political leaders. The question is, what does the takeover really mean? Okay, so in the next term of the EU institutions, not only will there be a considerably larger number of radical right populists in the European Parliament, there will for the first time be radical right populists in the European Commission. This has never happened before. In the past, radical governments have appointed people who socialized rather quickly into the College of Commissioners and moderated their positions, and they may have sometimes spoken quite radically, but they didn't block things actually in the college. They didn't prevent things going on the agenda. They didn't prevent legislation going forward. Sometimes they would alter it and so on. And we could argue about how much Bolkestein did this. We could argue a little bit about a few others. But on the whole, they played the game. This can really change if there are 4 and maybe even 6 commissioners who are sent to Brussels by their governments in order to wreck things. That will be really fundamentally different. And this, comes to Mary's point about, if you start messing up the system, if you start trying to destroy democratic politics from the inside, that's messy. It's also the case, especially with quite delicate institutions. Now, it's not often you hear the word delicate applied to the European Commission, but I would argue it is. The political balance within the college is often very delicate on getting controversial legislation through. And given the urgency of action on climate, on regulating tech, on looking at how demographic change is going to change European societies, we don't really have time to have at least one term of the Commission pulling in its horns and being very cautious because of the blocking effect of anti-establishment commissioners, and certainly not 2 terms. So it matters a great deal. And so that's the Commission, then there's the Parliament. Well, the Parliament is not going to have an overall majority of 2 parties. It might be a 4-party majority, which is much harder to manage. We could go into the dynamics of that. But the Parliament too could find it difficult to pass legislation. And if that happens, the community method can't deliver because of the effects of a very different agenda in the Commission, primarily a blocking agenda, I'm thinking. And I'll come to your point about it could also be a moving agenda, but a blocking agenda. I think that the member states will end up resorting more and more to intergovernmental deals. It could look much more like what happened during the Euro crisis and then, in fact, the migration crisis, where you essentially have the governments doing deals outside the community method, sidelining the institutions. Now, you can argue, I think, really about how is that actually more democratic, that the leaders of the country do deals among themselves as opposed to through the institutions. It depends very much how you define democracy and how much you believe in the EU level of multi-level democracy. But there's no question that it will be a very different way of operating from the past. And in the Council as well, at the moment, we're seeing a great deal of blocking by certain member states. Now, that could lead to institutional changes even without treaty change, which I think is quite unlikely. I think treaty change is quite unlikely to happen. But, for example, majority voting on foreign policy is starting to become much more popular than it was in the past because you've got 1 or 2 member states blocking every single document, every single measure with the word migration in it. And that starts to have a big impact over time. So I think there are ways in which the system is already shifting in relation to the challenges. But a lot of it depends on the ambitions. Is it just blocking or is it putting forward an agenda? And you made the point about European nation states. It's a slogan like many others. But border security, repressive measures, this would be much more serious. Now, in the past, the MEPs from radical right populist parties have tended not to actually take part very much in the legislative process. A few have, but many have essentially used the European Parliament as a combination of cash machine and YouTube channel, i.e. a resource for their national political campaigns in one way or another. But could you get more those who really try to push the legislative agenda and who maybe also tie up with commissioners who have cabinets who can work inside the system? That would be a completely different thing that the EU has not faced before. It's really very serious if that starts to happen because, in fact, decision-making in the European Union is quite opaque, and it's often hard for the public to see where blocking is leading and where agendas are getting changed on the inside. And my prediction would be, if that happens, what you'll see is just a much reduced level of ambition at EU level, just at a moment when civil society would be rooting for much more active, much more radical action.
Rosa.
I'll try to be brief so we can have another round. Yeah. On the populist and also on the takeover point that Luke made, I think we need to be, this is not just about populism. There is a far-right movement which is wanting to destroy Europe from within, in the sense renationalize policy, in the sense of pushing towards more intergovernmental cooperation on issues where they might converge. They actually don't really converge, but they seem to be overcoming certain differences. So I think we need to be very aware of this. And maybe I'll just add one point about what right-wing populists do when they come to power. They capture the institutions of the state by placing their loyal members within it. They start designing clientelistic policies to keep consensus, and they close down civil society. These are the 3 things they do, and they've done it. We can see it on an everyday basis in several countries, including countries that are still have vibrant civil society. So in my view, if we want to talk about political change or the future of of Europe, we really need to frame it through the lens of democracy, because this is the next battle. And in order for democracy to be maintained, I do think we need to renew its institutions and its practices. Now, democracy has grown within the space of nation states. I mean, you know, the history of the 19th century is one of national self-determination alongside democratic self-determination. And I think that is where we need to think about change. Otherwise, the risk is that the debate about the future of Europe is a debate between nationalism and technocracy, which I think is a totally unhealthy debate, which has actually led us to where we are now. So I do think democratic change has to be the way in which we look at climate change policies, immigration policies, all this range of issues. And I think the missing link is the powerless, is the bottom-up dimension. And we need to think about different processes here. It's not necessarily going to substitute the role that political parties played in the post-war period, as we heard in the previous panel, but it's certainly going to inject a different quality to democratic life at the level of the citizens.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have a second and final round of questions or comments. Let me see. We are, of course, to use the cliche, the thing that stands between you and lunch at this point. Let me then, okay, Mariette.
Thank you. I was hesitant because I already asked a question in the last panel, but I have a lot of questions. So thank you for your excellent introductions. I wanted to deepen a little bit this question of democratic deficit, and also the question of the European level of engagement being far away. And sorry, my name is Marietje Schaak, I'm a member of the European Parliament, so I look more at the receiving end of people trying to capture our attention, offering petitions, emails, inviting us to sessions, etc. And I have two questions just to start your thinking. One is, you know, how does EU engagement, EU-level engagement compare to national and local engagement? Is this a general question of how many people are willing to engage on a political level or civil society for that matter, or is it a typically European issue? Secondly, wait, did I forget my point? No, secondly is because the EU is organized the way it is, people voting for national parties, many NGOs being organized on a both local, national and European level, is it really that far away? Or is it more organized around issues? So for example, recently we had a very controversial copyright law. I received a petition of 5 million, quite a few signatures. There had been a debate for years and years, both happening on the local, national level, but people gravitate around issues and maybe not so much around, you know, the municipality or the parliament or the European Parliament, rather around climate change or, I don't know, digital laws or inequality or security or whatnot. So I sometimes wonder, what does success look like compared to the status quo? And, you know, where are we aiming for? What's a realistic level of success?
Okay, who wants to start? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Mary.
well actually I wanted also to, it also relates to what Rosa was saying at the end, because one of the things I did as a result of Brexit was to start a local Brexit project. And to send out, we did a series of reports on 5 local areas, and then we have local discussions, reports on the impact of Brexit, because I was very concerned, first of all, at this distrust of expert evidence, and secondly, you know, that people really weren't, how would you engage Leavers and Remainers without just having a row? And the idea was to try to have a discussion about what Brexit would mean for their areas, rather than a discussion about whether you are for or against. And I think what has emerged is exactly the point that Rosa's making, which is this huge frustration, well, particularly in the left-behind areas, the areas that voted Leave, that were declining manufacturing, declining mining, that they feel nobody cares about their local situation, nothing they do, nobody they vote for, and it doesn't matter really whether it's Brussels or Westminster. They have no political role. And that came out most strongly from the local, from all the discussions I've been involved in, is this huge frustration that they have no voice. And that nobody is really concerned about their issues. So that's one thing I wanted to say. I just wanted to agree very much with Rosa. But then on the issues, this is something I had wanted to fit into what I was going to say, and I didn't have time, so it gives me a chance to say it now. I sort of feel that the problem, I'm the post-68 generation who were involved with peace and human rights and all these issues, and we took social justice for granted. We thought we'd won those battles with the welfare state, and we didn't have to go on fighting them. And it was not just, you know, I think the post-68 movements grew out of a sense of frustration with the overbearing state, really. And because of the way in which parties had their privileged access to the state, that was another reason that the post-68 movements became much more internationalist and started trying to address the European Union and other things. And I think along with the post-68 movements, there was another movement which became neoliberalism. There was a movement of market fundamentalism that was also opposing the overbearing state, and actually they came together in the 1980s. And I think that's reflected. If you think about the people who care most about social justice tend to see that their main target to address is the state. They're much less European. Whereas the people who care about human rights and climate change, and you know, if you think about the European Union, I think the areas that it's progressive in are all those post-68 areas, their climate change, their digital rights. But on social justice, the left very much stays at a national level, and everything's free for corporate lobbying and so on and so forth. So shifting social justice to the European level is incredibly important. So I think, you know, what I'm trying to say is not a direct answer to the question, but I think my generation made a big mistake, actually, and it left, particularly Eastern Europe, suffered from it tremendously, because we didn't continue. I mean, I remember these debates we had with our East European friends who believed passionately in the market and dismantling all kinds of social systems, and we didn't kind of engage in it to the extent that we should have done. But anyway, that's a separate point, and now it's coming back to the fore. But just finally, to go back to my local Brexit project, I think what was really interesting was that lots of the people who were engaged in the discussions we held were actually receiving money from various different kinds of European structural funds. And you know, there was the kinds of issues that people were concerned about, skills training, actually not so much immigration, interestingly, but skills training, investment in infrastructure, those kinds of local issues that they were really preoccupied with. They found, many of them actually, even if they were for Brexit, found that European funding was much more sort of locally targeted than British funding, and they were extremely worried about what was going to happen. So on these, you know, for instance, there's a fund for digitalizing small businesses. Well, that's terribly important to lots of people. It's quite a small fund, but they're very worried. They were very worried. This was in a town called Mansfield, that this would disappear with Brexit, and the British government would just put in a lump sum and it would disappear. So you're absolutely right. When it comes to the local issues, you know, they're navigating European, national, municipal in different ways.
Heather and Rosa, final thoughts.
A quick point before
Briefly,
you go to lunch. So, I mean, Mary's point is very fundamental, and I think it actually answers Maritia's question in another way as well. Because if people are gravitating towards issues and not institutions, how does the party contest deal with those issues? Many of the issues that are now coming up are actually not ones where parties are setting out very clear policies and long-term visions on how to deal with climate, for example. There's very little of that. Also, demographic change, plus, of course, the question about tech regulation. I mean, you got the petition of the 5 million on copyright. Those are the only 5 million. It's really hard to engage people on some of these very complex issues that involve trade-offs across generations, trade-offs across industries. It's a difficult thing. So it's good that there's deliberation about them. It's true that contest is the way to go. But how do you involve the EU in that without making the EU very deeply unpopular? Now, the EU, I think the EU level, certainly the institutions in the way that they presented the response to the Euro crisis, totally underestimated how unpopular being the guardian of fiscal discipline was going to make the European Union. Just look at how Salvini immediately tried to pick a fight with the Commission over the Italian budget, essentially just as a means of bolstering his own popularity. Making the EU the bad guy is an old game, but it became so much easier to use that because of the EU getting blamed for austerity. And that's where the EU really missed a trick. If the EU had put forward, for example, unemployment reassurance across the EU as one of the main measures, then at least there would have been some kind of benefit coming from EU level, not just the stick rather than the carrot. Alle Peitsche keine Zuckerbrot, as the Germans say. So I think that's really important. But it's important that it's also not just an add-on social pillar. And so Mary's point about social justice is absolutely vital. The risk is that in the very complex renegotiation of the social contract between state and citizen that is coming, that will come in the next decade as social security and pension systems become unsustainable because of demographic change. And everything from healthcare to pensions will have to be renegotiated in each member state. Can you have that renegotiation happen just country by country? How do you deal with the externalities and spillovers where there will be competition between different member states on all kinds of issues, and there will be plenty of issues that are transnational? But can the EU play a role in that doesn't make it seem like constantly the enemy of social justice? Will the EU be the fall guy? Could it be that the EU will get blamed by governments as introducing all the unpopular measures, and then national governments claim the credit for the benefits? So I think we've got to move away from the idea of the social pillar being an add-on to social justice being a core EU objective if we want to avoid that situation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to Václav Havel because in his essay, The Power of the Powerless, I don't have the quotation, but he says you don't need to have a fully blown ideology to bring about change. What you want to do is people taking action, living within the truth. That's what he talks about. And for me, that was very inspiring because it fits in very nicely with my idea that actually through transnational civil society networks, you can actually introduce change, and you don't necessarily need to have the end vision there. So yes, I think issues are a mobilizing feature. I think the ability of these networks to coordinate with each other needs to be strengthened. And I think also their ability to work upwards towards the EU level can be strengthened. I mean, they can behave like lobbies to bring about certain change. So I'm going to end with a musical metaphor, which is a bit pretentious, I know that, but it just came to my mind. So the EU started as a sextet, then gradually became an orchestra and a symphony, and then started to go out of tune, sometimes because the instruments didn't work anymore. Some players were not very good. That's kind of what happened. And I think maybe what it needs to do is change music and move to jazz, which is a bit more improvised, and test out different methods and models to go about things, which eventually will, the end result will be, through the painful moments, maybe something different. So that would be my final words.
Thank you very much. I'll dovetail on your metaphor and going back to Machiavelli, who of course had the distinction between fortuna and virtu, and of course we're buffeted by destiny, fortuna, but there's virtu, or our capacity to steer our destiny, and I think that's where the ad-lib jazz comes in. Before we go off, I'd just like to make a plug-in because we'll continue this discussion in a different format tomorrow at the Palazzo Vecchio in the Sala Lorenzo il Magnifico on looking at issues of illiberal democracy and how to engage them with a number of Eurosceptics, with Professor Halmay here from the Institute, starting at 2 p.m. So those of you who are interested in deepening further the debate that we're having, please join us. So buon appetito, and let's thank the panelists once again. Thank you.
May I have your attention, please? The morning sessions are now over. The afternoon sessions will start promptly after the lunch break at 14:45. Please be sure to be ready to start according to schedule. Lunch will be served in the gardens and courtyard. If you need any kind of assistance, please ask our staff members at the help desks. Thank you.